the U.S. Army and the Nisei before Pearl Harbor. On 7th December 1941, the United States was plunged into a war with Japan. Bitter fighting throughout East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific ended almost 4 years later with the defeat and occupation of Japan. The U.S. Army needed soldiers who could read and speak Japanese to serve as translators, interpreters, and interrogators. In an unprecedented experiment, the Army turned to an ethnic group it had previously distrusted, American citizens of Japanese ancestry, known as Nisei, second generation, and trained thousands for the Military Intelligence Service, MIS, while their brothers were fighting in Italy and France with the famous 100th Infantry Battalion and 442 Regimental Combat Team, RCT. The MIS Nisei fought in secret using the language of their parents' homeland to help win the war against Japan for America, the land of their birth. In this way, they overcame racial prejudice and proved their loyalty, skill, and V. After the war, the Military Intelligence Service Language School grew into the Defense Language Institute Foreign Language Center, an enduring legacy of the Nisei's service to the nation. The Nisei entered the U.S. Army 1940 to 1941. America did not begin preparing for war in earnest until 1939, by which time the war was already raging around the world. Germany had conquered Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, quickly adding France and other countries, and attacking Britain by air and sea. In the Far East, Japan had clashed with the Soviet Union, was waging war in China, and threatened Europe's Southeast Asian colonies. America's diverse ethnic groups all followed the fighting with concern, none more so than Japanese immigrants and their American-born children. Like other Americans who could trace their ancestry to lands engulfed in war, Japanese Americans hoped that America could avoid open conflict with Japan. If Japan and America went to war, they would have much to lose. In September 1940, the U.S. Congress approved the first peacetime draft. The selective service system began to affect all Americans, as local boards across America registered 16 million men between the ages of 21 and 36. That December, the board sent out the first induction notices, and fresh manpower soon began to swell the Army's ranks. Draft notices reached into every corner of America, whether black or white, rich or poor, even to groups that had not yet fully shared in American society. On the West Coast and in the territory of Hawaii, they reached into the homes of the 284,000 Japanese immigrants and their families. Japanese American communities responded with pride. In late 1940 and into 1941, they held festive ceremonies for their Nisei sons being inducted into the U.S. Army. Most of the parents, known as Issei, first generation, had come to America before 1924, when Congress had closed the door to further immigration from Japan. Their children, the Nisei, were citizens by birth. The Nisei and their parents hoped that military service would dispel any lingering questions of their loyalty to America. When the day came for the young men to report for induction, many towns hoisted the stars and stripes alongside the rising sun, symbolizing the Nisei's dual heritage. The festivities featured patriotic speeches by community leaders, group photographs, and traditional songs in Japanese and English. Prominent families hosted banquets in local restaurants. Some families gave their sons traditional Japanese senenbari, thousand-stitch belts, into which female family members and friends each had sewn one stitch for good luck. Some Issei mothers wept openly, others remained silent. Issei fathers swelled with pride, often recalling their own service in the Japanese Army many years before. Now their sons would finally gain recognition as true Americans. They could be Yankees and samurai. The Issei parents told their sons that it was now their duty, possibly to die for their country. Above all, they must never disgrace the family. No bring shame. Cheers rang out. In Japanese, Banzai, 10,000 years. And in English, good luck. The Nisei were following in the footsteps of other American minority groups that had used military service to obtain recognition and citizenship. During the Civil War, Frederick Douglass had described the progression in vivid terms. Let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S. Let him get an eagle upon his buttons, and a musket on his shoulder, and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on the earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship. For the Nisei, military service was an important sign of acceptance into the mainstream of American society. The Nisei, like Chinese Americans and other immigrant groups from Asia before them, had grown up under the shadow of racial prejudice, reinforced by American fears of Japanese militarism. The Japanese invasion of China in 1937 had raised some Americans' fear and hatred of Japan to new heights. Donning U.S. Army uniforms was the culmination of the Nisei generation's rise to recognized citizenship. When the Japanese American Citizens League, JACL, held its national convention in August 1940, President Walter Tsukamoto proclaimed his support for selective service and called upon every American of Japanese ancestry to offer his life, if necessary, in defense of his country. Tsukamoto himself set the example, holding a commission in the Officers' Reserve Corps. His successor as president stated the political calculus even more bluntly. In February 1941, the number that we send into the Army is one of the best evidences as to where our loyalty lies. In the spring of 1941, a Nisei political activist from Salt Lake City, Mike Masaoka, wrote a summons to patriotism, which the JACL published as the Japanese American Creed. Masaoka called on each Japanese American to defend America against all enemies, foreign or domestic, and to actively assume his duties and obligations as a citizen, cheerfully and without any reservations whatsoever. The Issei felt pride at seeing their sons in uniform, but could scarcely conceal their anxiety that these American-born soldiers might have to fight against Japan. They could take comfort that President Franklin D. Roosevelt promised in 1940 not to send American boys into any foreign wars, and that the Army's stated role was limited to hemispheric defense. Issei hoped that America and Japan could avoid a war that would place their sons in an impossible position. Because the U.S. Navy, Marines, and Air Corps refused to accept most Nisei enlistments, the Army Ground Forces took the Nisei selectees. By the spring of 1941, more than 1,000 at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii and a similar number in Army camps on the West Coast were in basic training. Together with hundreds of thousands of other young American men, they were learning the basics of soldiering. Thomas Tokyo Sakamoto from San Jose, California, was the oldest son of 11 children. When he turned 16, his Issei parents sent him to Japan for schooling. After 4 years of studying at a Japanese high school, Sakamoto returned to America in 1938 to help his parents start a 43-acre fruit and vegetable farm. When he was drafted on 26 February 1941, a large crowd of Japanese Americans from the local community came to bid farewell to him and several other Nisei draftees. As the train slowly moved from the then Santa Clara train station, he recalled, the families waved both the U.S. and Japanese flags, shouting Banzai over and over. The echoes of Banzai stayed with me for a long time as we rode the train with mixed feelings. As the oldest son, I worried about leaving my parents and the farm, wondering just how my parents would get along without my help. Sakamoto took his basic training at Fort Lewis, Washington, and was then assigned to an anti-tank company. Born on Maui in 1919, Hoichi Kubo had attended public schools in Hawaii and then enrolled at the University of Hawaii, majoring in agriculture. Both his grandfathers had fought in the Russo-Japanese War. He was drafted on 30th of June and took basic training at Schofield Barracks, where he was assigned to the medical section of the 298th Infantry. Although the interwar Army permitted no Nisei enlistments, thousands attended colleges offering the Reserve Officer Training Corps, ROTC. By 1941, several hundred Nisei were enrolled at the University of Hawaii, where they were allowed to join ROTC and earn reserve commissions. Another 500 Nisei were enrolled at the University of California at Berkeley, where they were not allowed in the ROTC. When the Army called most reserve officers to active duty in the autumn of 1940, few Nisei were included. By the summer of 1941, about 3,000 Nisei wore the brass letters U.S. They represented the intersection of two stories: how the Japanese came to America and how the U.S. Army prepared for war with Japan. The war that would eventually bring these stories together in previously unimagined ways. Japanese in America, 1885 to 1941. For over 50 years, immigrants from Japan had been coming to Hawaii and the mainland, and staying to raise families. They began arriving in Hawaii in 1885 to work on the plantations and grew in number to comprise over half of Hawaii's agricultural labor force within a few years. Some moved onward to the mainland through Seattle, San Francisco, and Los Angeles to work as farmers, fishermen, and shopkeepers. These strangers from a different shore were not eligible for citizenship. The 1900 census counted 85,393 Japanese living in America, of whom 72% lived in Hawaii. Like the Chinese before them, the Japanese encountered racial prejudice in the New World. The Chinese had endured prejudice against Orientals that began during the California Gold Rush and culminated in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Japan's dramatic 1905 victory over Russia inflamed anti-Japanese prejudice in America. The California state legislature and the U.S. Congress further restricted Japanese immigration. The Japanese government acted to protect its citizens, and in 1907 to 1908 negotiated a gentleman's agreement with the United States that restricted further immigration to family members. In 1913, California passed an alien land law that prohibited individuals ineligible for citizenship from purchasing land. Other states soon followed suit. The Japanese persisted, but lived under a cloud of suspicion, prejudice, and legal restrictions on the part of their non-Asian neighbors. Despite the discrimination, hundreds of Issei served in the U.S. Navy from the 1890s until 1907, usually as messmen and cooks. When the USS Maine blew up in Havana Harbor in 1898, 7 Issei on board lost their lives. During the First World War, over 1,000 Issei, mostly from Hawaii, served in the U.S. Army. After the war, these veterans sought to become naturalized citizens. In 1925, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against them on the basis of race. But in 1935, the U.S. Congress reversed the decision and granted them naturalization rights in exchange for their military service. By 1920, the population of Japanese descent living on the mainland United States and Hawaii had risen to 220,122. By the time Congress slammed the door to further immigration from Japan in 1924, the Issei had already established families and continued to grow in number. The 1940 census counted 284,731 persons of Japanese descent living in Hawaii and on the mainland. By this time, more than half were citizens by birth in a land that did not fully accept them. Most Japanese Americans were still strangers to their neighbors. The average American could see only an alien presence within the American melting pot. In Hawaii, Japanese Americans comprised more than a third of the population and formed thriving communities within that multiracial society. They were moving out of the plantations into other sectors of the economy, but they remained under the domination of the white oligarchy. Nevertheless, in the 1940 elections, 13 Nisei were elected to the territorial legislature. 16. On the West Coast, Japanese Americans made up a much smaller percentage of the population. They worked as farmers or as keepers of small shops. Many lived in the Japantowns or Little Tokyos of Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Seattle. In Hawaii and on the mainland, the Nisei raised families and built the institutions of the immigrant community, including schools, churches, temples, and civic organizations. Some were Buddhist and some were Christian. As the years passed, some Nisei returned to Japan. Most abandoned the dream of returning. The Japanese government remained solicitous of its subjects residing in America and maintained consulates in Honolulu and the major West Coast port cities. The Imperial Japanese Navy periodically sent training vessels to call at American ports, where the local Japanese communities always greeted them warmly. The Nisei sent their children after regular school hours to Japanese language schools. They hoped their children would remain connected to their ancestral homeland, but they could see that for all America's faults, it was a far better place than Japan for their families to live. Although they were denied citizenship, the Nisei had made their lives in America, a country that held great promise for their children. The Nisei had an outlook very different from their parents. Born and raised in America between 1910 and 1940, the Nisei attended public schools and spoke English, or in Hawaii, Pidgin Hawaiian, among their friends. The parents sometimes sent their children to Japan to visit relatives or attend school. But American and Japanese observers were unanimous that at heart, the Nisei were growing up as American boys and girls. The lure of American society and culture proved far stronger than the distant call of their parents' homeland. The Nisei were a problematic generation from the beginning, an object of concern for their Nisei parents and scholars alike. Like most children of immigrants, they grew up between two worlds. The Nisei lived in two societies, wrote one sociologist at the University of Hawaii. The home, the language school, and the Japanese community formed one. Surrounding this smaller world was the rest of American Hawaii. Much of what the children learned in one society, they were expected to forget or disregard in the other. 18. The pull of assimilation was strong. From their classmates, they learned the stuff of American popular culture, music, movies, slang, and sports. From their schools, they learned the civic culture of interwar America, Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln, the Pledge of Allegiance, and an intense loyalty to their country. On the West Coast, the best known of the Nisei generation was John Fujio Iso, born in 1909 in Hollywood, California, where his father worked as a gardener. His parents stressed academic achievement and patriotism. His mother hung pictures of Washington, Lincoln, and Jesus in the family parlor to inspire her children. Encountering prejudice early in life, Iso responded by studying harder. In 1922, he ran for student body president of his junior high school. When he won, the principal dissolved the student government rather than permit a Japanese boy to take office. When this incident was publicized, Iso became the iconic Nisei. In the 1920s and 1930s, Nisei parents in Southern California pressed his example on their children. Iso was his high school class valedictorian, having achieved the highest academic ranking. A skillful debater, he nevertheless was denied a top spot on his school's team in the national championships in 1926. The publisher of the Los Angeles Times sponsored Iso to accompany the winners to Washington, D.C., where he was introduced to the Japanese ambassador. After a year of Japanese language study in Japan, he entered Brown University on a Japanese government scholarship. He followed this with a law degree from Harvard in 1934 and then worked in New York, 1934 to 1936, and Japan and Manchuria, 1936 to 1939, practicing American and Japanese commercial law. He returned to California in 1939, passed the state bar exam, and set out to practice law in Los Angeles. In April 1941, Iso was inducted into the Army when the 31-year-old private, first class, reported to D Company, 69th Quartermaster Battalion, Light Maintenance, at Camp Hahn, Riverside, California. A regular Army Master Sergeant snarled, "Just what we need, another goddamned lawyer. He sent ISO to the motor pool to be a parts clerk. The exemplary Nisei, talented and overeducated, became just another soldier in the rapidly expanding army. As war approached, many Americans became increasingly suspicious of the loyalty of the Nisei, regardless of the evidence of assimilation of American values. Many white Americans found support for their suspicions in the tangle of U.S. and Japanese laws that left many Nisei with dual citizenship, claiming this as proof of loyalty to the emperor. The truth was more complicated. Until 1924, Japan automatically extended citizenship to children born abroad of Japanese nationals. After 1924, the parents had to register their children with the local consulate for Japanese citizenship. Many Issei, denied U.S. citizenship themselves, took this simple step for their children, realizing that their antagonists could use dual citizenship as propaganda. Nisei leaders seized the issue as yet another way to demonstrate their loyalty. They encouraged and assisted Nisei to file with Japanese consulates the necessary paperwork to revoke their Japanese citizenships. Nevertheless, the War Department was sufficiently concerned about the issue that in the spring of 1941, the Military Intelligence Division, MID, recommended that Congress allow individuals to clarify their status simply by swearing an oath of allegiance to the United States in naturalization court. Moreover, some suspected that Japan was conscripting American-born Nisei to serve in the Imperial Japanese Army. In 1940, Senator Guy M. Gillette, D. Iowa, even charged that Japan was conscripting Nisei for espionage, which the JACL vigorously protested. Nisei visiting Japan in the 1930s indeed risked conscription while in Japan, but there is no evidence that Nisei in Hawaii or on the mainland were being conscripted. Nevertheless, this accusation circulated widely. For the U.S. government and most white Americans, Nisei loyalty remained an open question. In the autumn of 1941, the White House secretly dispatched an investigator to make an independent assessment of the Japanese problem. After conferring with Army and Navy intelligence and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Curtis B. Munson reported that the Nisei were approximately 98% loyal. The Nisei, he concluded, are pathetically eager to show this loyalty. They are not Japanese in culture. They are foreigners to Japan. Another aspect of the Nisei culture that raised suspicion was their Japanese language schools. Like other immigrants, Issei parents set up private language schools so their children could learn something of the Japanese language and culture. Typically, these schools held classes 1 hour each afternoon after the public schools let out, as well as on Saturday mornings. Caucasian Americans pointed to these schools as one more example of how even the children of Japanese immigrants were being indoctrinated into Japanese culture and loyalty to the emperor. In fact, these schools did little to inculcate Japanese values in the Nisei, and even less in teaching the language. For most Nisei, it reinforced their sense of themselves as American, not Japanese. Carrie McWilliams, California journalist and editor of The Nation, downplayed the schools. The fact of the matter is that these schools were never successful. The typical Japanese youngster, he wrote, spent a precious hour and 1/2 tossing spitballs at his classmates and calling his teacher names in American slang, which she pretended not to understand. Physically, he was in school. Mentally, he was making a run around left end for another touchdown. He was restless. He counted the minutes. At the gong, he dashed to freedom. Some Nisei did pay attention and acquired a working knowledge of the Japanese language, but they were the exceptions. Brig. General John Weckerling, who established the 4th Army Intelligence School in 1941, later concluded that Japanese language schools created and encouraged by the Japanese government before the war to maintain ties with the homeland had not achieved the results with which they were generally credited. Some went to experience Japan for themselves. Inexpensive steamship fares made travel between the United States and Japan relatively easy. Many Issei made the return trip or sent their children to stay with relatives. Other groups such as Chinese and Filipinos periodically traveled back to their homelands or sent their children. By one estimate, 50,000 Nisei visited Japan before the war. Perhaps 20,000 had returned to the United States by the autumn of 1941. Japan for schooling. For others, the trip resulted from a family emergency, such as the death of a parent. Nisei, who visited Japan and then returned, became known as Kibei, return to America. 30. Many Americans feared that the Kibei had been exposed to the bacillus of Japanese militarism. The effects were usually quite the opposite. Upon arriving in Japan, the Nisei were often ostracized for their funny speech, manners, and dress. Munson reported, many of those who visited Japan, subsequent to their early American education, come back with added loyalty to the United States. In fact, it is a saying that all a Nisei needs is a trip to Japan to make a loyal American out of him. The American-educated Japanese is a boor in Japan and treated as a foreigner. 31. While studying in Japan, Kibei often were exposed to compulsory military training in Japanese middle and high schools. Thomas Sakamoto took such training while attending high school in Japan. When he graduated in 1938, a Japanese army major offered him a commission in the army. Sakamoto declined because he was an American citizen. He recalled that the Japanese officer became agitated and waved his sword and called the young man a traitor to his homeland. Sakamoto returned soon afterward to his real home, California. 32. As diplomatic tensions rose in the autumn and winter of 1940 to 1941, the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo contacted Nisei visiting in Japan and urged them to return home. Those who had been in Japan the longest suffered the most, some having almost completely lost their ability to speak English. Now, they were cast adrift in Hawaii or on the West Coast, with little chance of finding work. Those who enrolled in American high schools were older than most other students. They sometimes found themselves rejected by both worlds. John Iso described the Kibei's experience. With over 20 years of close infighting against prejudice and discrimination heaped upon him by chauvinistic elements in both the United States and Japan, he was by 1941 already a mentally and morally battle-conditioned veteran. In the impending crisis, the army would come to prize the Kibei for their language skill. Who better to translate or interpret that difficult language? But often the same Kibei felt most keenly the anguish of the two countries going to war. For, as Iso put it, those best qualified for G2 service were those whose sentimental heartstrings for relatives and close friends tugged the strongest. The Military Intelligence Division prepares for war with Japan. 1940 to 1941, the War Department's Military Intelligence Division was ill-prepared for war with Japan or any other country. War Plan Orange called for the Army to defend the Philippine Islands in the event of war with Japan, but the Navy would wage the decisive campaign. 35. MID itself had dwindled in size during the interwar years. Combat units lacked intelligence personnel and the specialized schools to train them, and few officers valued intelligence as a career. One exception, Colonel Rufus S. Bratt, headed MID's Far Eastern Branch after 1937. A West Point graduate, he had served 3 tours in Japan. 36. The Signal Intelligence Service, SIS, fared little better in apprehending Japanese plans. It had radio intercept stations targeting Japan from Fort Shafter, Hawaii, and Fort McKinley in the Philippines. In Washington, D.C., a handful of officers, enlisted men and civilians, had been decrypting and translating Japanese diplomatic messages since August 1940. However, with the low volume of messages intercepted and decrypted, the Army needed only a handful of translators. By early 1941, it was clear that the Military Intelligence Division had to prepare for a possible conflict with Japan. If the US and Japanese armies should meet on some future battlefield, combat intelligence would be critical. This would require soldiers who could read and speak Japanese. The War Department needed speakers of European languages as well, but these were easier to find, having been required in previous wars. Major General Charles A. Willoughby, General MacArthur's chief of intelligence during the war, later commented that linguist requirements for the European theater of war could have been met without leaving the sidewalks of New York City. But there was a vastly different story in the Far East. From January through March 1941, the United States and Britain held their first staff talks in Washington to coordinate their defense plans in the Far East. Soon after, MID sent a former language attaché, Lieutenant Colonel Moses W. Pettigrew, to the Far East to assess the overall intelligence posture against Japan. He met with American and Allied intelligence officers in Honolulu, Manila, Hong Kong, Chongqing, Singapore, and elsewhere, and returned with a great sense of urgency. As a result, the Army published a handbook on Japanese military forces in July 1941. The Army also decided to establish a Japanese language training program. The War Department possessed one valuable resource: a small group of regular Army officers such as Bratton and Pettigrew, who had learned Japanese through the language attaché program. In Tokyo, the U.S. Embassy had operated a joint language training program for the Army, Navy, and State Department since before the First World War. In the 1920s, the embassy hired Naoi Naganuma as a language instructor. Naganuma developed a set of textbooks and readers with which all the language attachés became familiar. Each year between the wars, MID sent 2 officers to Japan for 4 years of language training and service as assistant military attachés. Language attachés took intensive language classes in Tokyo and often were subsequently sent to Japanese Army units as observers. They came away with a first-hand appreciation of the Japanese Army, its soldiers, leaders, tactics, equipment, and spirit. When then First Lieutenant Weckerling returned from Japan in 1932, he published an article in the Cavalry Journal describing his tour and urging other officers to volunteer. By 1941, MID had a pool of more than 40 officers who could speak at least some Japanese. However, not all were available by then, many being retired, incapacitated, or beyond the age and rank of interpreters. Weckerling later explained, the Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, had a similar number of language-qualified officers. Army and Navy intelligence officers were also responsible to protect U.S. territories against espionage and sabotage. MID and ONI coordinated their efforts with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. The Japanese populations on the West Coast and in Hawaii were prime suspects, as were the Japanese communities in Mexico, Panama, and the Philippines. Stunning German victories in Europe since 1939 greatly increased American fears of a fifth column. Inside their own country, MID, ONI, and the FBI developed active surveillance programs directed at Japanese communities in the United States and its territories. In 1933, the G2 of 9th Corps area at the Presidio of San Francisco gave a reserve commission to David Swift, a Japanese-speaking customs inspector born in Japan. Swift reported to G2 what he found out about Japanese visitors to the busy port. The 12th Naval District intelligence officer retained John Anderton, a San Francisco lawyer who had learned Japanese and knew the local Japanese community, to be a translator. When Captain Frederick P. Munson returned in 1937 from his tour as a language attaché in Tokyo, he was assigned to 9th Corps Area Headquarters in San Francisco. The headquarters wanted a Japanese-speaking person, he recalled, particularly to work with the Navy and FBI on Japanese relations in San Francisco because we had a lot of Japanese going through there and they were doing all kinds of things. In 1939, the War Department assigned then Major Weckerling to the Panama Canal Zone to keep an eye on the substantial Japanese population there. MID also posted Japanese-speaking officers to the Hawaiian and Philippine departments. 48. Growing concerns led the FBI to reopen its office in Honolulu. In August 1939, local Army, Navy, and FBI offices hired a few trusted Nisei as translators, interpreters, even as undercover informants. As early as 1931, the Hawaiian Department G2 recruited Jiro Iwai to monitor the local Japanese. He was one of the first Nisei to receive a reserve commission through the University of Hawaii ROTC. In 1937, the 14th Naval District Intelligence Officer recruited Douglas T. Wada, a graduate of the University of Hawaii. In other ways, intelligence officials obtained the quiet cooperation of Nisei community leaders who provided information on Isai and Nisei. In the spring of 1940, FBI officials in Hawaii organized Nisei advisory committees. In Los Angeles, on 21st March 1941, Nisei leaders held a meeting with representatives of the Naval Intelligence, the Army, the county government, the Chamber of Commerce, and the Metropolitan Press. At the meeting, the 11th Naval District Intelligence Officer, Lieutenant Commander Kenneth D. Ringel, and other military and local officials reaffirmed their belief in the loyalty of the Nisei and rejected any accusations of disloyalty. Nevertheless, intelligence officials had some cause for concern about the Japanese government. In January 1941, Tokyo urged its consulates in Hawaii and the West Coast to step up efforts to gather information using U.S. citizens of foreign extraction other than Japanese, aliens other than Japanese, communists, Negroes, labor union members, and anti-Semites. As for the Issei and Nisei, the Japanese Foreign Ministry advised, in view of the fact that if there is any slip in this phase, our people in the U.S. will be subjected to considerable persecution, the utmost caution must be exercised. However, Japanese espionage efforts brought few rewards beyond what was freely available in the daily newspapers. American surveillance of the Issei was tightened in the autumn of 1940 when Congress directed the registration of all alien residents, allowing government agencies to open investigative files on all Issei. In the spring of 1941, the FBI broke into the Japanese consulate in Los Angeles and photographed documents that detailed Japanese espionage operations on the West Coast. In June 1941, the FBI broke up an espionage ring of Japanese military officers, but found no evidence of Nisei involvement. The War Department was also concerned about Japanese fifth-column activity in the Philippines, where Japanese residents numbered over 20,000. In late 1940, the Philippine Department G2 asked the Hawaiian Department to send 2 reliable Nisei to infiltrate the Japanese community in Manila. In March 1941, the Hawaiian Department G2 selected Arthur S. Komori and Richard M. Sakakita. Neither had ever set foot in Japan, but both spoke excellent Japanese. The Department G2 secretly enlisted the 2 young men into the Corps of Intelligence Police, later redesignated the Counterintelligence Corps, and sent them undercover by steamer to Manila in April. There, they infiltrated the Japanese business and diplomatic community and soon began reporting valuable information to the Philippine Department G2. Sakakita found work as a desk clerk at a hotel favored by Japanese visitors and began to win their trust. That summer, when the U.S. government froze all Japanese assets, Sakakita helped Japanese businessmen fill out their declaration forms, carefully remembering any information they asked him not to write down, which he later passed to his superiors. Despite the use of individual Nisei in sensitive assignments, and considerable success in countering Japanese espionage. American officials remained uncertain of the loyalty of American-born Nisei before the war. No amount of Nisei cooperation or fervent declarations of patriotism, such as the Japanese-American Creed, could allay white suspicions that at least some Nisei might prove disloyal. Nisei leaders worked hard to dispel these fears. They even feared their expressions of patriotism might backfire and make whites more suspicious than ever. Intelligence officials searched for a formula that would tell them what they wanted to know. Could they trust the Nisei, but not the Issei? Were Christian Japanese more trustworthy than Buddhists? Could they trust Nisei, who had never visited Japan, but not those who had? Could they trust only Nisei, who seemed more Americanized and took no part in Japanese community organizations? Put this way, the question was unanswerable. How could an outsider evaluate participation in sports clubs, language schools, community-sponsored events, or even Japanese government-sponsored study tours to Japan and Manchuria? How to weigh having relatives in Japan, absent any explicit evidence of disloyalty? How could Army, Navy, or FBI officials look into the hearts of the young Nisei men in particular, many of them still in their teens or 20s, and predict the future? The Nisei would have to demonstrate their loyalty in action under the most difficult circumstances. But first, they would have to be given the chance to do so. A masterstroke: establishing a Japanese language school. April to October 1941. If the U.S. Army were to defeat the Japanese Army, it would need not just a few dozen officers, but hundreds and possibly thousands of interrogators and translators. On 24 March 1941, without specifically mentioning the Nisei, MID directed the 4th Army G2 to survey its ranks for Japanese-speaking soldiers. In the event of a major emergency involving Japan, there will be a great demand for Japanese-speaking men in intelligence units of many combatant troops and for certain duties under the War Department. It would appear desirable, therefore, to have readily available some record of this personnel, together with such information as to probable loyalty and ability as is obtainable. 4th Army, headquartered on the Presidio of San Francisco, was the Army's area command on the West Coast. That spring, the headquarters was consumed by the mobilization of regular Army and National Guard divisions in training camps, stretching from the 3rd Division at Fort Lewis, Washington, to the 7th Division at Fort Ord, California, to the 40th Division at Camp San Luis Obispo, California. As an indication of the seriousness of the mobilization, on 17 March, the War Department designated 4th Army as the Western Defense Command, WDC, under Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, one of the Army's most senior general. See Map 1. By the summer of 1941, 4th Army counted over 100,000 soldiers, including 1,000 Nisei. Even so, it soon became clear that the 4th Army's ranks would not yield enough proficient Japanese speakers to meet requirements. The Army needed a training program. The former language attachés knew that Japanese took longer to learn than did most European languages. The training would take at least 6 months. But the War Department had few alternatives. Weckerling later wrote, "Those few who realized the language difficulties involved in prosecuting a war against the Japanese were alarmed by the lack of our preparations in this regard." 57. In April, Major Carlisle C. Dusenberry, a former language attaché then in the Far Eastern Branch, suggested using Nisei soldiers as linguists. Some Nisei, he thought, already spoke Japanese and would need training only in the military aspects of the language. He discussed his idea with Major Wallace H. Moore, who had been born in Japan of missionary parents and had taught at the University of California before being called to active duty. Together, Dusenberry and Moore sold the idea to their branch chief, Colonel Bratton. After the war, school officials esteemed their idea as a master stroke. At that time, the War Department had no schools for training in foreign languages or in combat intelligence. The Signal Corps operated a small school at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, for radio intelligence. In November 1941, the Corps of Intelligence Police established its own training school in Chicago. MID itself was neither staffed nor organized to supervise a school, so the logical choice was to assign the task to 4th Army, the command nearest to potential instructors and students. In June 1941, the Far Eastern Branch got to work on the problem. On 23 June, Colonel Bratton asked the G2 to direct 4th Army to establish a school with a minimum of 50 Nisei students. As he envisioned it, the program would consist of 3 months intensive review of the language, mostly oral, 2 months study of military terminology, 1 month's instruction and application of the language to combat intelligence, specifically examination of prisoners and duties of interpreters in the field. The Adjutant General's office provided data on the number of Japanese Americans in uniform, reporting that as of March 1941, there were 1,690 Nisei in the service, divided roughly equally between Hawaii and the mainland. Hundreds more were being inducted each month. The Far Eastern Branch also asked Colonel Munson, the military attaché in Tokyo, to purchase and send to 4th Army some Japanese dictionaries. On the 1st July, the War Department directed 4th Army to establish an intelligence school to train combat intelligence personnel for work as translators and interpreters of the Japanese language. The directive came just in time. That month, relations between America and Japan plunged deeper into crisis when Japan occupied French Indochina and the United States froze all Japanese assets, imposed an oil embargo, and recalled General Douglas MacArthur from retirement to establish a new command, U.S. Army forces in the Far East. The Office of Naval Intelligence withdrew its naval officers studying Japanese in Tokyo, but the Army language attachés remained in place. The United States was ill-prepared for war in almost every respect, not the least in the languages of the Far East. In early 1941, the Rockefeller Foundation awarded a $100,000 grant to the American Council of Learned Societies for the development of intensive instruction in foreign languages. The scientific linguists at several universities proposed to begin methodically with a descriptive analysis of each selected language before moving on to preparing instructional material. In July 1941, Cornell University sponsored a 3-day conference of Japanese language teachers from 7 American universities. Representatives of MID, ONI, and the FBI attended. The officers found the results sorely disappointing. They learned that only 60 Caucasian students nationwide were enrolled in college-level Japanese language courses, mostly from a purely literary, artistic, or philological point of view. According to one participant, it became obvious to all concerned that the teaching methods and techniques then in use were in a state of unmitigated confusion. On the conference's last day, the War Department representative, Major Wallace H. Moore, stood up and delivered a harsh assessment. "Well, gentlemen, you haven't got a thing that's any use to the government at all." The Army and Navy officers left the conference determined to do the job themselves. The Army realized several advantages in having its own Japanese language school at the Presidio of San Francisco. Among them, Captain Kai E. Rasmussen, a Coast Artillery officer, then commanding harbor defenses for San Francisco Bay. Rasmussen had emigrated from Denmark to the United States in 1922 and enlisted in the Army. He was selected for the U.S. Military Academy class of 1929. He later spent 4 years in Japan, learning the language and observing the Japanese Army. He returned to the States in 1940, but instead of using his language skills, the Army assigned him to command Battery E, 65th Coast Artillery, guarding the Golden Gate. By the spring of 1941, Rasmussen was serving on the 4th Army staff, overseeing the harbor defenses. The Army would soon have great need for his language skills. Building a Japanese language school presented a daunting challenge. Rasmussen could hardly expect to screen all the Nisei soldiers himself. To help out, Mid sent another language attaché, Captain Joseph K. Dickey, who had been serving in the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. Dickey sailed for San Francisco in August. To lead the effort to build a school, the War Department dispatched a more senior officer, Lieutenant Colonel John Weckerling, promoted that summer. He arrived in San Francisco in September. A 44-year-old infantry officer, Weckerling had enlisted in 1917 and subsequently earned a commission as a language attaché in Tokyo. From 1928 to 1932, he had watched as the Imperial Japanese Army occupied Manchuria in 1931, returning to Tokyo as the assistant military attaché from 1935 to 1938. He had watched as the Japanese army attacked China in 1937. After a total of 8 years' duty in Japan, he was well versed in the Japanese threat. Since late 1939, he had served in Panama, searching for possible Japanese subversion, espionage, or sabotage directed against the canal. Now he would be searching for Americans of Japanese ancestry and recruiting them for language training. These three former language attachés, Rasmussen, Dickey, and Weckerling, worked together to assemble students and instructors. That summer, the Western Defense Command held the largest maneuvers ever seen on the West Coast. All regular Army and National Guard units under DeWitt's command remained in the field for several weeks, enduring long hikes, choking dust, and stifling tents. In the intervals between marches and training exercises, a strange scene played out hundreds of times in various camps. An army officer appeared wearing civilian clothes and carrying secret orders. At the camp headquarters, he presented his credentials and asked to meet every Nisei soldier in the camp. When each soldier reported to him, the mysterious officer showed him a Japanese army manual and asked him to read a few passages. Captain Rasmussen found PVT Thomas Sakamoto assigned to an anti-tank unit on maneuvers at Fort Hunter Liggett, California. Sakamoto remembered a man wearing civilian clothes and speaking with a Scandinavian accent. The Danish-born Rasmussen took Sakamoto into a field tent, pulled a Japanese field manual from his coat pocket, and asked him to translate some passages. Since I graduated from the Japanese high school in 1938, reading and translating this textbook wasn't difficult. Sakamoto recalled that Rasmussen mentioned the chance of a commission if he would volunteer for the school. Sakamoto soon received orders for the Presidio. Captain Dickey visited the 40th Division at Camp San Luis Obispo and interviewed Private Masaji Jin Uratsu, a Kibe who as a child had lived 5 years in Japan. Uratsu was ordered without explanation to report to division headquarters. Scared and apprehensive to say the least, Dickey produced several Japanese field manuals and requested that I read and translate portions of the manuals. The whole procedure, which lasted about 30 minutes, seemed like an eternity to me. Upon conclusion of the interview, the officer stated that I would be hearing from him again, and he warned me, in no uncertain terms, that this interview was not to be revealed or discussed with anyone. 2 months later, Uratsu and 3 other Nisei from the camp received orders to report to the G2, 4th Army. For most Nisei, the interviews proved embarrassing. One of the books the officers used was the Imperial Japanese Army Field Service Regulations, Sakusen Yomure. Another was the Japanese Military Academy textbook on applied tactics, Oyo Senjutsu. Even if the Nisei had paid attention to their lessons, none knew the complicated Japanese military terminology, Heigo. Perhaps their fathers could have read these materials, but the Nisei could not. The Nisei probably recalled all those boring afternoons spent in the Japanese language school while their non-Japanese friends were already on the baseball diamond. When tested, even if some could speak a few words of simple Japanese, most could not translate even the simplest sentences. From July to October 1941, Rasmussen, Dickey, and Weckerling interviewed all 1,300 Nisei soldiers on the West Coast. For reasons of time, or perhaps not wishing to cross command lines, no one screened the Nisei serving in Hawaii. In December, Weckerling reported to the War Department, "The general impression gained by Rasmussen and me in our interviews with these men was an excellent one. The majority seemed eager to serve, although the nature of the school, classified by the War Department as secret at that time, could not be fully explained. Many thought that it was to be organized along FBI lines, but their eagerness to serve still remained high. Only a few were obviously sullen and uncommunicative. The officers then tried to determine the loyalty of each Nisei candidate based on the interview and security questionnaires, which they used for background investigations. In addition to the few malcontents, about 30% of the Nisei had a parent or sibling living in Japan, an automatically disqualifying factor. For the remaining candidates, the officers questioned families, neighbors, and teachers. In some cases, they searched the candidates' homes. Many were blackballed by the investigator simply because of racial prejudice or because the person being investigated had made a trip to Japan or had belonged to a Japanese athletic club. Weckerling reported that only 40 men were sufficiently qualified linguistically to pursue a 6-month course in the Japanese language. Of all Nisei screened, only 3% could be rated accomplished, 4% proficient, and 3% fair. Of the Nisei interviewed, Weckerling reported only 17 men spoke, read, and wrote Japanese proficiently, indicating a gradual moving away from the influence of the first-generation Japanese. The army officers were especially interested in Kibei, like Sakamoto and Uratsu. Ironically, some Kibei spoke English so poorly that they were of little use to the army. Weckerling identified about half who had lived in Japan only for a short period of time, and whose outlook is essentially American, or who as a result of their visit to Japan were embittered against the Japanese by treatment received there. The other half had attended school in Japan and lived there for a longer time. During this stay, it is probable that, while in Japan at any rate, the thought of those who returned to Japan at a very early age was predominantly Japanese. In many cases, the influence of Japan had disappeared since their return. The Kibei proved to be the most valuable of all. A few even had personal knowledge of the Japanese army from having served as conscripts. Weckerling deemed 5% or less of the Kibei completely unsuitable for military service, describing them as those unassimilated elements who have, or believe they have, cause to hate the United States. Those whose parents have maintained a very close tie with the old country. Those who went to Japan as infants and only returned within the last year or two, their outlook being wholly Japanese. The War Department also searched for Caucasian soldiers who spoke Japanese, to little avail. Many claimed an ability to speak Japanese that far surpassed their facility with the language. Only 2 Caucasian enlisted men were selected for the first class. Both had lived in Japan for a time and spoke some colloquial Japanese. Weckerling later concisely described how the selection of Nisei of unquestioned loyalty, reasonably qualified in the Japanese language, became the primary task. In 4 months of searching, the Army officers found 58 Nisei who met these 2 criteria. The Office of Naval Intelligence prepares for war with Japan. 1940 to 1941. ONI was making its own preparations for the coming conflict with Japan. For decades, the U.S. Navy had been rehearsing War Plan Orange. ONI used radio intercept stations to monitor the Japanese fleet. District intelligence officers kept watch over local Japanese communities on the West Coast and in Hawaii. In Washington, the ONI Far East Section employed a handful of Japanese translators. The section chief, Lieutenant Commander Arthur H. McCollum, had been stationed in Tokyo in 1922 to 1925 and again in 1928 to 1930, and spoke Japanese. In 1940, he happened upon Glenn W. Shaw, an acquaintance who had taught English in Japan and had published translations of modern Japanese plays and novels. McCollum made him chief of the translation section. The Navy had its own small pool of officer linguists using the same program at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. Several former naval language attachés worked in the Far East section and understood the urgent need for more Japanese linguists. Several were already attacking the Japanese naval and diplomatic codes. The effort would soon require many more. In the autumn of 1940, as the Navy began calling reserve officers to active duty, Albert E. Hindmarsh, a professor of international law at Harvard University, obtained a commission and approached the Far Eastern branch to offer his services. While spending a year as an exchange professor at the Imperial University in Tokyo, he had learned some Japanese. In December 1940, McCollum gave Hindmarsh and Shaw the task of developing a Japanese language program for the Navy. In the spring of 1941, they conducted a survey of college students and found 56 who had some potential to learn the language. The Navy could not draw upon the services of Nisei as easily as the Army for one simple reason. As the Navy rapidly expanded in 1940 to 1941, it had continued its traditional racial exclusion policies against Asians. Filipinos were allowed to serve, but only as cooks and mess stewards. If the Navy wanted Japanese linguists, it would have to train them from scratch. In July 1941, McCollum and Hindmarsh attended the disappointing language conference at Cornell University. Upon returning to Washington, Hindmarsh recommended that the Navy establish its own language program through contracts with leading universities. At Harvard University, he secured the services of one of the leading Japanese scholars in the country, Russian émigré Professor Serge Elisev. Elisev was a world authority on Japanese art and theater and taught the Japanese language. He and his younger protege, Edwin O. Reischauer, had just published a 2-volume textbook for the Japanese language. While visiting California, Hindmarsh chose Florence Walney, an unknown language instructor at the University of California. Walney had been born in Nagasaki, the historic seat of Christianity in Japan, and was raised by missionary parents. In 1931, she left Japan for the United States and graduate studies. While completing her doctorate, she supported herself by teaching Japanese. The personable Miss Walney counted many Nisei among her students. McCollum and Hindmarsh narrowed their list of potential students to 48, all native-born United States citizens, white, male, and anxious to serve the Navy. Most of them had lived and studied in Japan or China, had university degrees, and were in the age bracket of 20 to 30. All were promised reserve commissions upon graduation. Instruction began on 1st October 1941. With 27 students at Harvard and 21 at the University of California at Berkeley. Meanwhile, in July 1941, the U.S. Marine Corps sent 12 reserve officers to a separate program at the University of Hawaii to learn Japanese. For textbooks, McCollum had the naval attaché in Tokyo send copies of the Naganuma readers. 50 complete sets arrived in September. Hindmarsh then designed a practical course of instruction that crammed the 3-year Naganuma course into one. The final course objectives were vague. "We didn't have anything specific in mind," he later recalled, "but we thought it would be useful to have some people who could handle the language." At Harvard, Professor Elisev did not like naval officers telling him how to teach Japanese. The Navy directed him to use the Naganuma readers, but he preferred his own textbook. Hindmarsh visited in November and wrote a sternly worded report that demanded changes in the curriculum. which Alexiev ignored. Meanwhile, things were much more to the Navy's liking on the West Coast, where Miss Walney had fewer preconceptions about the right way to teach the language, and her students were making steady progress. As Army officers interviewed prospective students, a delay in the establishment of the school was barely averted, Weckerling recalled, as MID wavered on whether to open a Japanese language school at all. Some argued it would be better to open a centralized intelligence school. That summer, a group of military intelligence officers visited Britain and were impressed by the British Army's interrogator training school. When they returned to Washington, D.C. in July, they recommended that MID establish a similar school. One of the observers was the 4th Army G2, Lieutenant Colonel Donald A. Stroh, who agreed with the British approach, but his assistant G2 in San Francisco, Weckerling, disagreed, as did the officers in the Far Eastern Branch. They argued that the psychology of captured Asian personnel was quite different from that of captured Germans. Hence, the need for a separate school that would teach only Japanese and interrogation techniques appropriate to Japanese prisoners of war. At the end of August, the Far Eastern Branch won out, and MID directed 4th Army to proceed with establishing their school as soon as practicable. Another threat to the school came from a new Army organization, General Headquarters, GHQ, responsible for the supervision and direction of Army training. In June 1941, GHQ moved to block MID's plans for intelligence training. In July, 4th Army requested GHQ's permission to start a Japanese language school. MID endorsed 4th Army's request, but conceded that the question of training translators and interrogators is only one phase of combat intelligence training. MID recommended that a War Department study should be made to determine the needs of all task forces for translators, interpreters, and interrogators for all required languages, rather than only Japan. GHQ then approved 4th Army's request and allowed the school to proceed. The General Staff scheduled a meeting for 8 December to decide which War Department staff section would control language and intelligence training. The meeting would never happen. By October 1941, 4th Army had assembled 60 students to begin Japanese language training at Crissy Field on the Presidio of San Francisco. Across the San Francisco Bay, at the University of California, the Office of Naval Intelligence had begun training Caucasian officer candidates and had a similar program at Harvard University.